The integumentary system is going to function as a barrier, but there are also other functions as well. Those are going to include protection. There is thermoregulation, the regulation of body temperature. There is cutaneous sensation. So this would be primarily by nerve receptors. There is metabolic function. This would be mainly the synthesis of vitamin D. And there is also blood reservoirs. And this idea of the blood reservoir is referring to the fact that a lot of the blood is actually going to be present and stored in the dermal blood vessels, and there is excretion. So there are 6 different functions that you should be aware of. Our next slide is showing protection, and the 3 types of protection are either chemical, physical, or mechanical, and then also biological. The chemical is going to be due to the skin secretions, and this would be predominantly sebum, which is secreted from the sebaceous oil glands. And the sebum is going to be responsible, or one of the factors responsible for the idea of an acid mantle. The acid mantle refers to the fact that there is a low pH of our skin that actually prevents the growth of bacteria. And there is also melanin, which is going to be protecting the fragile DNA which is found in the nucleus. So those are all chemical. The physical or mechanical is primarily going to be due to the keratin, which remember is a tough fibrous protein that's present in the keratinocytes. And then the biological barrier is going to be found by such cells as the epidermal dendritic cells, as well as the macrophages, and the macrophages are found in the dermis, but both of these are going to provide an immune protective function. And then there's also the DNA itself. There's electrons in DNA that are going to absorb ultraviolet radiation, and actually by doing this, the DNA converts the potentially destructive radiation into harmless heat. Then the second important function is thermoregulation, body temperature regulation. So what happens when we are in a hot environment and a very cold environment? So we're well aware of the first example in Florida because of the heat. And when this happens, one way that our body cools itself is dilation of the dermal blood vessels. And so this is going to allow for perspiration, and there is about a half liter of perspiration per day that we actually do not notice. So 0.5 liters is 500 milliliters, and this would be the unnoticeable perspiration that we don't see. However, the noticeable perspiration that we do see, the visible output, would be on a very hot day, and this visible output is, as you would expect, called sensible perspiration or sensible water loss, because we can actually see it. Now, on a very cold day, the opposite is going to happen. So in order for our body to warm itself, there's going to be constriction of these dermal blood vessels, and the blood is actually going to be shunted to deeper organs to help to warm us. And as you know, one of the other mechanisms to also that happens is we start to shiver, so our skeletal muscles are going to start to contract in this case. The third function is cutaneous sensation, and so this is going to be due to the exteroceptors, and the exteroceptors are the receptors that are on the integumentary system, external part of our body, and we have the Meissners or the tactile corpuscles, and these are going to be found very superficial, and they're in the dermal papillae, which remember is the most superficial region of the dermis. There's also a deeper region, or deeper exteroceptors, and these are the Pacinian corpuscles, or the lamellar corpuscles. and this is going to require deep pressure in order to be able to activate that. So these are located much more deeply than the Meissner's corpuscles are. The fourth function is the metabolic function, and this would be primarily the synthesis of vitamin D from cholesterol. And in order for this to happen, in order for the cholesterol to be synthesized into vitamin D, one of the requirements for this is sunlight. And there can be disorders that result from a lack of vitamin D, because then the calcium is not going to be absorbed into the body. So this could actually affect the bones as well. There's some other examples where there are chemicals that are actually converted to protect us, chemical conversions of carcinogens and some hormones. And then the fifth function is the blood reservoir, and it's important to remember that up to 5% of the body's blood volume is actually stored in the dermal blood vessels. So the dermis has a great ability to move blood to where it's needed the most. And then the sixth and final function is excretion, and this would be the elimination of nitrogen waste from the body, nitrogenous waste compounds. And these would be things like ammonia. Ammonia is NH3. There's also urea, and there's uric acid. Now they do a test in the hospital which is called the BUN, and that stands for blood, urea, nitrogen. And so if the BUN result is too high, this means that the kidney is not doing its job by getting rid of important nitrogen. But also the integumentary system, we know, can also be one of the excretory systems, and it can also get rid of nitrogen-containing compounds. Now the next section of your chapter is on skin cancers. These are homeostatic imbalances that you do need to be aware of. And the first type is the basal cell carcinoma, and this one is the least malignant, and it's also going to occur when the cells in the stratum basale are cancerous. Then there's the squamous cell carcinoma, which is the second most common behind the basal cell carcinoma. And then the worst is melanoma, which is quite rare, but this would, in this case, this would be cancer of the melanocytes. Now when we talk about cancer, the word cancer really just means it's an abnormal growth of a damaged cell. If it starts to spread, the term for spreading is called metastasize. Most of the time, though, these growths, these tumors, are actually benign, and so benign means harmless. So when they identify something that they suspect of possibly being cancer, they are going to remove it and biopsy it to see if it is in fact cancerous. One of the reasons that this could actually occur is we have a gene called the p53 gene, and this gene is a tumor suppression gene. So it's naturally going to have the ability to suppress cancers. So if there is something like ultraviolet radiation that actually disables this very important gene, then that could be a risk factor for cancer. One interesting medical discovery that they've made is that there are actually certain skin lotions that can fix the damaged DNA. And the interesting thing about that is these skin lotions are going to have enzymes within them, and these enzymes are going to repair DNA mutations. So there's a lot of potential, especially for this type of lotion, for future medical breakthroughs. So this next slide is, I've added some pictures here as well, but one of these pictures is in your textbook of the basal cell carcinoma. And the basal cell carcinoma, as I mentioned previously, is the least malignant and the most common skin cancer. It results for up to 80% of the cases. And in this case, the stratum basale cells are going to grow, they're going to proliferate and invade the dermis and the hypodermis. But full cure for this happens usually in 99% of the cases, as long as surgical excision is used. And what you need to notice about this cancer is the abnormalities that you see with the border. And the border is going to be one of the important characteristics to identify whether something could be possibly cancerous. The squamous cell carcinoma is the second most common skin cancer, and in this case it arises from the keratinocytes of the stratum spinosum. And so remember that this is the layer that is just superficial to the stratum basale. And what you see here again is the irregularity in color all throughout. This is a micrograph, but you can see certainly there's different colors on the picture that you see on the left of your slide. And so it often is found in places like the scalp, the ears, and the lower lip. But if it's caught early and removed surgically or by radiation therapy, the prognosis is quite good. And then the third type is the melanoma. And the melanoma is cancer of the melanocyte itself. And this is the most rare, and it's going to account for about 2 to 3% of skin cancer. But the incidence is quite growing. It is increasing by about 3 to 8% per year in the United States. And there's poor survival if the size is greater than 4 millimeters. So again, the size that we see here is going to be another important factor to identify whether it could be a melanoma. And so these letters that are in your textbook are going to be important in helping you, helping to identify whether something could be a melanoma. So we're going to use the ABCDE rule, and we are going to apply the E as well. So you should know what these letters stand for. The first is that if it's asymmetrical, so if the two sides of the pigmented area do not match. So instead of having a perfect circle, we have one side of a circle and maybe a squiggly line on the other. That's a possible indication. Then the border, if it is irregular and does exhibit indentations, which we see in this one as well. Color, and you've seen the color example in the previous slides with the squamous carcinoma, the squamous cell carcinoma, and then also the diameter. So if it's larger than 6 millimeters, the size of a pencil eraser, and remember in melanoma, as you can see here, if it's greater than 4 millimeters, then there is a poor survival rate. And then the last one will be the elevation off of the skin. So the last part of the chapter that you need to know about is the burns. And a burn is any sort of tissue damage that does occur, and this tissue damage can result from things like heat, electricity, radiation, or certain chemicals. And the reason this can be so bad is that it's going to denature or destroy proteins that are in the cell and eventually lead to cell death. And one of the reasons this can be so bad is the immediate threat would be loss of fluids, so dehydration can happen very, very quickly. There can be electrolyte imbalances, so this could really damage the cardiovascular system or possibly the nervous system. It could lead to kidney shutdown, renal shutdown, or the person could even go into shock if they've lost enough blood volume. So there are lots of very, very serious results from burns that could happen. Now, in order to diagnose whether there is how bad the burn is, kind of a general rule that is used is called the rule of nines. And the rule of nines is going to divide the body into 11 areas, and it's going to more or less give a general estimate of the severity of the burn. So each area is going to account for about 9% of the total body area. So the anterior head is 4.5, so the total anterior and posterior head would be 9%. Each limb would be a total of 9%. The anterior trunk would be 18%. posterior trunk 18 as well, and so on. The perineum is going to be the additional 1%, so it accounts for a total of 100%. But one of the more important problems is, again, immediate loss of calories. So a burn patient needs to be provided with a lot of additional calories. A lot of times this is going to be supplied through gastric tubes and IV lines, because depending on how bad the burn is, the patient would not be able sometimes to eat all of these calories. Another possible threat beyond what we've already discussed here would be sepsis. And there's a lot of deaths that happen because of sepsis. The word sepsis is referred to as a widespread bacterial infection. So bacteria is certainly one of the big fears that happen with burnt skin. So great care has to be taken, especially with a full thickness burn. So there are 3 different types of burns that you need to be aware of. The first type is a partial thickness burn, and this applies to both first-degree burns and second-degree burns. And a sunburn is usually a first-degree burn. You can see this shown on your slide here. There's a first-degree burn on the fingertips, and then a second-degree burn on the palm of the hand. But in the first-degree burn, there is usually going to be epidermal damage only. It's localized redness, there is swelling, edema, and there certainly would be pain that occurs. And in this case, in the first-degree burns, there is actually no blisters. So blisters are going to be one of the main characteristics of second-degree burns. And a second-degree burn is going to damage the epidermis and also the upper dermis as well. And so the blisters are actually going to occur due to the separation of the epidermis and the dermis. And then the third-degree burns are going to be referred to as full thickness burns. These are involving the entire thickness of the skin, so this is the worst. And you can see a terrible looking picture here on your slide. There's no initial edema or pain, but that's only because the nerve endings are destroyed. But as soon as the nerve endings start to grow back, then there is extreme pain that happens. Skin grafting is going to be necessary at this point. The first thing that they need to do is to isolate the patient. So they isolate the patient, and they're going to place them in an oxygen tent. But they want to definitely, prevent the bacteria from growing. They're going to be doing skin grafts. And because remember, this means the entire dermis is also damaged. So it's really the whole skin is damaged. That's why it means it's referred to as a full thickness burn. And in general, burns are considered very, very critical if any of the following apply. So if 25% of the body has second-degree burns, or if 10% of the body has third-degree burns, or if there are third-degree burns that are on very important areas like the face, the hands, or the feet. And the reason this can be so deadly, so damaging, is because if there's damage to the face, chances are there could be damage to the beginning of the digestive tract, the inside of the mouth, and so on, and important mucosal membranes. So this would mean that the burn is particularly critical in these 3 situations. And so the rest of your chapter is on developmental aspects of the skin, and you're not responsible for the developmental aspects of the integumentary system. You want to definitely use the outline that's at the end of chapter 5 to help you study, and the review questions,